right after, while Castellano, rather than open the books, they just started moving around existing members and sort of shuffled around the crew's leaders. And it meant if Roy Demeo wanted to get made, he was going to have to find other ways. But like we said earlier last week, that it was going to take really Roy Demeo sort of merging the Westies with Castellano that would get him, his induction into the Mafia as well as the murder of Castellano's son-in-law. So basically things begin to ramp up even more, and the crew begins to have some internal problems. And for one of the first times, they're going to go after somebody from their own crew, and that would be Danny Grillo. While Roy had used Danny Grillo to sort of help, without Grillo, Roy doesn't get the in with the Westies. And Grillo sort of begins to get sloppy. Not just sloppy, at least from a criminal aspect, but he begins using drugs, and it sort of made him very hard for Roy to deal with. It also didn't help that he was borrowing money from Roy, and the payments were getting further and further behind and getting later and later. And one of the things that Roy does, he sits Grillo down and he sort of explains, you're playing a game that you shouldn't play. He suggests to him that he should get off the fucking drugs and even up with the money he owes and just stop making drama. Grillo pretty much looks at Roy and just says, everything's fine. There's no problems. Roy, you're worrying too much. And another few months go by, and Roy sits him down again and just sort of gives him the come to Jesus fucking meeting. And it eventually reaches to the point where Roy is getting embarrassed, because the way that Roy handled his fucking business was that he'd give you a pass once or twice, because Grillo was involved in the crew. But after a certain point, his reputation is on the line. And if anybody finds out that Roy's letting a guy get over on him, it's a problem. Because if one guy does it and tells another guy, then everybody starts doing it, and then he was going to have a big problem. And so Roy reaches the point where it's like, look, even though I like you, it just sets a bad example. It sets a bad precedence to the rest of the crew. And the eventuality of it is nobody's going to get over on Roy Demeo. So Roy did what Roy did all the time. He summoned Danny to the Gemini Lounge. Danny would enter the lounge. He would head downstairs and would be killed and dismembered. Years later, Danny's wife would explain that he must have known he was going to get killed because he left his wallet and his money at home that day, and he never went anywhere without it. Danny knew his time was up, and like a man, he drove himself to his death. It's just as simple as that. The problem with the Grillo murder, if there was one, was just the brutality of it. Many of the guys, while actively took a role in the murder, realized that if Roy was capable of killing somebody within their own crew that way, then ultimately they could all be killed in the same exact manner, and they begin to sort of second-guess their relationship with Roy. They still do what they do, but they're a little nervous, and rightfully so, I gotta say. Imagine Roy Demeo having a shit day, coming in and just ignoring you. I can't imagine the fear that some of these guys had if Roy was just having a fucking bad day, not knowing if he was just in a pissy mood or whether they had been marked for death or marked for some sort of Leatherface type of shit. So I can't imagine that working with him there was any comfortability. Freddie Deneau would end up joining the crew after Danny Grillo disappeared. Freddie had been driving Roy around for months and was now a member of the crew. The crew then begins to expand into the auto theft ring, and they sort of make it now an international thing. Freddie's expertise was basically in the auto field and in the auto theft field. He was not considered exactly smart, but he was the type of guy who was good with his hands, mechanically speaking. And so how did this international theft work? And it was basically very, very simple and easy to understand. Henry, Freddie, Anthony, and Joey would steal cars, and they would bring them into one of a couple of shops that they had. If the car was used for parts, they chop it up and sell the parts. Ronald Ustica and Abdullah Hussan were put in charge of moving these stolen cars to New Jersey. And the reason why is because that's where they were going to import the cars to put them in the containers to send them overseas. And the reason why this works so well is because over in Jordan and Kuwait, a lot of people were looking for exotic cars and didn't want to pay exotic prices. So what would happen is Roy would get a list of the cars that customers were looking for overseas, and he would send his guys out to do the work. They would be paid $150 per car. Then the car would be pushed into the garage. The VINs would be taken off or restamped. The locks would be changed, and new keys would be made for the cars. Henry, Joey, and Anthony would then drive the cars to Port Elizabeth in New Jersey, where Ronald Ustica would get the bill of lading correct, basically making it flush, making it look like a legitimate business, and then they would be put in containers and sent over to Kuwait. Between 1979 and April of 1980, 351 cars were sent to Muhammad Abbas Marifai in Kuwait in 13 shipments. By many accounts, they were pulling close to $250,000 a month. Each crew member was pulling in close to $30,000 a month per person. But it didn't mean that the scheme came without issues. In late 1979, Chris Rosenberg would fuck up. Let's just be honest. I don't think we could call it anything other than fucking up. And he fucks up in badly. It not only meant that his life was going to end, but this is also the beginning of the end for the Demeo crew. Chris Rosenberg, other than overseeing the car scheme, began to move big amounts of cocaine. He was always a drug dealer, but as his lifestyle begins to expand, he wants to finer things in life. He ends up buying a lot of legitimate businesses. He buys a couple of homes, and he starts buying cars. He needed to keep the flow of money coming, and that's why he really pushes into the heavy cocaine trade. He would begin by importing marijuana from Colombia and then moving big amounts of cocaine throughout New York City. In 1979, he ends up finding Connect for even more coke, and he flies down to Florida. He flew down on the premise to set up a coke deal with one of Roy's negligent loan shark customers by the name of Charles Padnick. Padnick, was a guy who knew a lot of different people. He owed Roy a lot of money, and Chris was going to use that to sort of like say to him, all right, well, you owe Roy a lot of money, so why don't you hook me up with the coke people, and maybe I can get Roy to back off a little bit. And that was sort of the deal. Padnick knew the right players in the coke game. He was friendly with William Serrano, who had Cuban cartel connections. Serrano specifically knew Pepon and El Negro, who were two cartel members down in Cuba. Padnick explained to Serrano that, he had a bunch of Italian mob guys who were looking to make a big score. Padnick meets, obviously, with Chris Rosenberg down in Florida, who doesn't tell him his name is Chris Rosenberg. He tells him his name is Chris Demeo, which is going to be a huge fucking issue. Then what happens is Padnick goes to Serrano, and he just basically tells him what the deal is, and the money was going to be good. So then there would be a meeting arranged back in New York for the facilitation of the narcotics. Charles Padnick and William Serrano, as well as the cousin of Serrano's Cuban drug dealing connection, El Negro, end up flying to New York to sort of get the deal done. Within hours of landing, they're shot to death, dismembered, and disposed of by Rosenberg and other members of the Demeo crew. In the melee of the murder, Rosenberg ends up getting shot and ends up not going to the hospital. Later, El Negro, who's waiting to hear back on what's going on, doesn't even get a phone call from his cousin or his girlfriend or anybody to just sort of tell him, hey, the deal's completed and everything's good. So what El Negro does is he contacts Charles Padnick's son, Jamie, in an attempt to find out what's going on. Jamie Padnick ends up flying to New York shortly after the fact and ends up disappearing. And obviously he was killed and dismembered by Rosenberg and other people of the crew because they're trying to cut all ties at this point. The Cubans at the time didn't have solid information. All they had was the name Chris Demeo. And all they knew is that, he had stolen 12 kilos of coke from them, and everybody that was involved is suddenly missing. El Negro then orders the death of Chris Demeo and anybody that's associated with him. He's furious. Somehow word traveled, and it gets back to Nino Gaggi, who is absolutely beside himself with anger. He calls Roy down and tells Roy Chris Rosenberg has got to be killed immediately and leave his body in the fucking gutter. Who cares? Fuck him. He created a problem. The thing is that Roy really, really cared about Chris and didn't want to kill him. El Negro somehow reaches out, and he basically sends a message to the Gambino crime family that if they kill Chris and they leave his body in public and that it gets in the newspapers, then he'll let it go, along with the money that he was owed for the transaction of drugs. Nino Gaggi agrees with El Negro. I don't even know if Roy, or excuse me, if Nino even really talked to him, but I think that Nino's perspective was, yeah, absolutely, that's what we're going to do. And he tells Roy exactly what's going to happen. And what Roy does, he starts stalling for a couple of weeks. He keeps stalling and stalling and stalling. And Roy also gets to be a little bit nervous because not only has he been stalling, but now there could be a situation on his hands that he can't control. And to further that, El Negro sends armed guys or armed gang members to New York to explain how the fucking world works. So now El Negro is showing them that, okay, you don't want to play, you don't want to do what I ask, I'm going to send people to New York, we're going to have a fucking problem. And so at this time, Demeo starts feeling heat from all different directions. And then Dominic Ragucci knocks on his door. Dominic was a 19-year-old who was going door to door selling vacuum cleaners to pay his way through school. Roy was informed that, at least from while he's in his house, that there's somebody that's Hispanic looking banging at the door claiming to be a vacuum cleaner salesman. Immediately, Roy starts to think that this kid was sent to Cuba to kill him. He pulls a gun from a desk and he runs to the front door. Ragucci is terrified, takes off, gets into his car and just takes off down the fucking freeway. Roy grabs Uncle Joe Dracula Guglielmo, and they end up in a car chase, firing shots out the window like, an old cops and robber movie. Eventually, Demeo fires enough shots to Ragucci ends up crashing the car, and of course Roy gets out of the car and fucking puts shots in his head and ends the problem right there. The problem was that this kid wasn't a Cuban connected anything. He was just simply a college student that was trying to fucking pay his tuition through college selling vacuum cleaners. So now they've killed somebody that had nothing to do with nothing. Not only is that the problem, but they still haven't taken care of Chris Rosenberg. Paul Castellano catches word of all of this and just is furious. He demands that Nino go see Roy and tells him, either you kill Chris Rosenberg or you're gone. We're going to kill you. Stop stalling before more people get hurt. This is a bad thing for the Gambino crime family. And ultimately, this probably should have gotten Demeo killed. It shouldn't have taken anything other than that. This should have been the thing that ended Demeo's life, especially killing an innocent victim. It really should have put his head in the stew, so to speak. But Castellano, for whatever reason, holds back. And so the crew is basically told to keep whatever information they knew about the Cuban shit to themselves and to treat Chris Rosenberg as if everything was just perfectly okay. They ended up waiting for Chris to come into the lounge, and when he did, he went downstairs. And sitting downstairs was Roy Demeo and Anthony Center, who immediately opened fire and killed him. Because the Cubans wanted a visible public display of his death, there was something that Roy was going to have to do. But Roy didn't have the heart to machine gun Chris Rosenberg to death. He just didn't have the heart to do it. So he orders Henry to take a machine gun and use it on Chris's car, and then they would put Chris in the car and drop it off on Cross Bay Boulevard. And that was meant to save face, to give the Cubans what they wanted, and to sort of give Nino and Paul what he wanted. And that's exactly how it went down, and it ended up satisfying the Cubans. By many accounts, Roy Demeo was never the same after the murder of Chris Rosenberg. Not long after that, Dominic Montiglio disappeared. In late 1979, sort of another issue comes up for the crew. Nino would have a beef with James Eppolito and James Eppolito Jr., two made members in his own crew. Now, if those names are familiar, they are related to Louis Eppolito, who was partnered with Stephen Caracappa, who did hits for Gas Pipe Casso. Both are dead now. But they were the uncle and cousin to Louis Eppolito, obviously, who years later would be indicted for murder for killing people on behalf of Gas Pipe, along with Stephen Caracappa, like we just said. While what I'm about to say has been reported, it really hasn't been reported accurately. Nino full well knew that the Demeo crew was pushing massive amounts of drugs. But he didn't want Paul to find out. And off the record, look, Paul knew that they were selling drugs, and he took profits, but he didn't want to know where they came from. And the thing is that we've talked about the narcotics dealing. Every boss knew that everybody was involved in it, but the whole thing is that don't get caught doing it, because that brought a ton of time. But getting back to James Ippolito and James Ippolito Jr., they were both selling drugs, and that's what this issue was about to be about. James Ippolito and James Ippolito Jr. had a beef with Nino over money. Nino had fucked James Ippolito Jr. out of some drug profits, at least indirectly. It was Roy who robbed him of $7,000, and he refused to give them their share or step in to help. After weeks of threats, Nino threatened to kill them and had no choice but to go to Paul Castellano for help. So here's what you have to make it a little more clear. So James Ippolito Jr. Was selling drugs. And Nino fucked him out of money indirectly because Roy went and robbed him of the money. And that was the issue. Their issue was he robbed $7,000 from us. Roy works for Nino. Therefore, Nino's responsible. And Nino, in turn, threatens to kill him. And they have no other choice but to run to Paul Castellano for help, which is what they do. So James Ippolito Sr. sits down with Paul Castellano and he says, look, Demeo and Nino are pushing a lot of drugs, and they robbed my son of $7,000. And it was a shock to Castellano. I think it was a shock in terms of this guy is admitting that his son is selling drugs. He's a made guy. That's a problem. He's also telling him that Nino Gaggi and fucking Roy Demeo are fucking selling drugs. And for Paul, he probably knew what was going on, but the fact that somebody was going to sit there and just admit that to him probably was a bigger issue. So I guess so Paul Castellano sits down with Nino Gaggi, and Nino denies it. This is not what happened. We didn't do that. I'm not selling drugs. Roy's not selling drugs. And so then Castellano ends up going back to Ippolito and talking again with him. And Ippolito, for some fucking reason, is still upset about the money. And he tells Paul Castellano that Nino Gaggi is an informant. And that Nino was impinging on his territory. So it went from he stole $7,000 to he's a rat to he's moving into my territory. And then Ippolito makes a huge fucking mistake. He asked for permission from Paul Castellano to kill both Nino Gaggi and Roy Demeo. Castellano just sort of, I don't know what Castellano did in that situation. He probably says, okay, let me think about this or whatever. But what Paul Castellano ultimately does is he ignores his own rules and he sides against the Ippolitos, and he calls Nino. And Nino arrives and he just tells Nino, look, I'm going to side with you and Roy. And if you want to kill these guys, go right ahead. Not a problem. And that's all that Nino Gaggi needed to hear. So in 1979, James Ippolito and his son were driving their 1978 Ford Thunderbird when they were pulled over. When they pulled over, they were having car trouble, and Anthony Center, Nino Gaggi, and Roy Demeo pull up and say, hey, you guys want a lift? And they decided to drive to the Gemini Lounge. Let me rephrase this. So they're driving down the street. They're having car problems. Nino Gaggi, Roy Demeo, and Anthony Center pull up and say, oh, you guys need a lift. Yeah, we need a lift. They get in the car, and they just kind of talk for a few minutes before they go anywhere. And, we should really handle this dispute. We should really just kind of get this over and done with. Let's go over to the Gemini Lounge and have a discussion about it. And stupidly, they agree to fucking do it. And so they get on their way to start to drive to the Gemini Lounge. Nino sat in front with James Jr., while Demeo and Ippolito sat in the back. During the journey, the elder Ippolito knew that he was going to be whacked, and he decided he had to get out of the car. He knew what was going to happen. He told his son to pull over the car so he could get out and go to the shitter. They end up pulling over in Coney Island. But before they could do anything and escape, Nino and Roy shot and killed both of them. But the crime didn't completely go without a hitch, because a witness who saw what was going on alerted an off-duty policeman, who soon found Nino walking away from the crime scene. After a brief shootout, Nino got into a shootout with the cops. The policeman ended up shooting Gaggi in the neck and ends up arresting him. Although charged with the Ippolito's murder and the attempted murder of the police officer, Gaggi was only convicted of assault for some fucking reason. He would be sentenced to 5 to 15 years in federal prison. Demeo didn't get caught because he went in a totally different direction than Nino did when this all went down, so he wasn't arrested or identified by any witnesses, so Roy gets away with it. So the Empire Boulevard operation, which was the international theft ring that the FBI dubbed what Roy DeMeo was doing as far as the car thefts, continued to expand through 1979 and 1980 until the warehouse serving as its headquarters was raided by agents from the Newark branch of the FBI in the summer of 1980. The FBI had been surveilling the warehouse, and some of the guys that were unloading vehicles there, got pinched. The FBI showed up. They got a search warrant, obviously. Henry Borelli and Freddie Denome were arrested in May of 1981 for their roles in that operation. But there was not enough evidence to arrest any of the other active members of that crew. DeMeo would order that Borelli and Denome plead guilty to the charges in hopes that it would just stop any further investigation into his activities or any of the crew's activities. The FBI only found out about what was going on because of former Fringe member Vito Arena. Now, I know we haven't talked about him. I just don't want to go into all of his nonsense, but Vito Arena had been calling the FBI, leaving anonymous tips about DeMeo and his crew operations, probably because he was frightened of DeMeo. Let's just be honest with it. Once in custody, FBI agents began working hard to get Freddie Denome to flip. He was not a hardened killer like any of the other guys, but had years of information about, especially with Roy DeMeo. Freddie was scared for his life and the life of his brother, Richard Denome, and that's ultimately why Freddie would end up turning in the end. So June of that year, Vito Arena was arrested and begins to be cooperating with the feds. Upon the release of some minor bullshit, Vito then disappears again before much would come of it. Roy was highly spooked by this case, and he orders Henry and Freddie to plead guilty to the case. Just plead guilty. This will all end. And the idea was basically that the FBI would just be happy with a couple of different convictions, especially with that of Denome and Borelli. For the time being, it seemed to work out as they were only sentenced to 5 years at that time. So by all accounts, Roy DeMeo thinks, okay, so, they pled out. This is going to be over and done with. The problem is they had a prosecutor in Walter Mack who wasn't going to stop, and he ends up taking over the case from another prosecutor, and the case now sort of begins to start to come together and look a lot bigger than they actually thought. Slowly, what was just a local car theft ring turned into racketeering and a murder case, which led from Roy to Nino and all the way up to Paul. They had a witness named Matty Rega who was able to make that connection, and he included Dominic Montiglio as a co-conspirator. Dominic, like I said earlier, had recently vanished. He had a falling out over Nino with his drug habit. He wasn't making enough money. And Mac really starts to see what this is all about, and he begins an all-out assault on Roy DeMeo, and with pressuring him on every single angle. Another cooperating witness was located, Joseph Bennett, who was the cousin of John Quinn, who was killed along with Sherry Golden. He was willing to testify against DeMeo and the crew in that particular case. So what Mac does now at this point is he sets his sights on finding Vito Arena and Dominic Montiglio, because if he can get the two of them, it's done. And those were the two individuals who could really provide firsthand accounts of how this worked, and they could be the ties with Paul Castellano, and that would hopefully, from the FBI's perspective, put the final nail in the coffin. So in 1982, the heat is on. Roy starts to get kind of paranoid, and then the feds picked up a conversation on a wiretap between Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti. And what they were discussing was that Paul Castellano had ordered the death of Roy DeMeo, but that no crews within the family had the balls to go after DeMeo. Gene Gotti was caught on wiretap saying that his brother John was terrified of Roy DeMeo. So John Gotti was terrified of Roy DeMeo. He furthered that with, while my brother may have killed 10 people, Roy DeMeo was killed 38 or more. For the record, John Gotti never killed 10 people. That's nonsense. So John Gotti was offered the contract. He refuses to take it. Then the murder contract gets handed to Sammy DeBulgravano, who doesn't want to do it, who gives it to Frankie DeCiccio, who couldn't find a single guy who was willing to fucking do it. And finally, DeMeo's own crew would take the job. It wasn't just Roy's sloppiness and brutality, but it was the fact that they had gotten Paul Castellano hooked into those crimes as well, which would lead to a life, obviously life without parole. And then eventually, that those particular crimes would insert Paul Castellano into the infamous commission case. And that was bad for the family. It wasn't just, there were a lot of moving parts to the commission case in general, but one of the biggest problems is that when Paul Castellano gets involved with Roy Demeo, which he probably shouldn't have done, all of the dots are connected, but they needed people to really come in from an informant perspective and say, look, so Nino is a captain here. These are his crew members. Nino reports to Paul. Paul knew about this murder. Paul knew about this situation with the Westies. And then on the back of this, the Westies are going fucking crazy, doing all kinds of crazy shit. They're not getting permission to kill people. They start just killing everybody. And this also connects to Paul. Everything connects back to Paul, and this is a big problem. Now, if you take away the auto theft ring and you push him to the side of all of that, you may not be able to get Paul indicted for a lot of this stuff, but these guys were sloppy, and that's what ended up happening. In May of 1982, the worst possible fucking thing for Roy Demeo could happen would happen. Vito Arena gets found, and he gets arrested. And then what does he do? He spills his guts to the feds, and he gives them all the information they needed to solve murders. Roy would find out, and then he would try to get word to Vito in jail to shut his fucking mouth, keep quiet. But the problem was the feds were listening. The prosecutor in this case, Walter Mack, literally ends up running into Roy Demeo on the streets, and he tells him, hey, Vito's now federal witness. You're fucked. And using a tip from Vito, detectives were able to locate the body of Joseph Scorney. This was a body that was cut in half and buried in cement inside of a drum. And this gives the feds everything they fucking need at this point. Because hearing about a murder is one thing, but if you got a guy that can connect the dots, tell you where to find it and who it was, why it happened, and who was responsible for it, then you've got it. Vito not only could tie Roy to murders, but the entire crew, including Nino, and by proving that Nino was involved, could prove that Paul Castellano sanctioned many of the murders that were happening. The problem is, and the reality is that Paul Castellano did not sanction half of the fucking murders that the Demeo crew committed. And I think too, from a legal standpoint, I because Paul was the boss, I understand, and that's how they connect the dots, and that's how they can charge him with it, because it's a criminal enterprise, conspiracy. I understand all of that. But the thing is that a lot of what Roy Demeo did was behind the back of Nino and behind the back of Paul. I think if they had known that earlier, they would have killed him, and they probably wouldn't have had the problems that they would have. And so what ends up happening is subpoenas start to go out. They go out to Joey Testa, Anthony Center, to Nino, and everybody associating the crew, including their wives. Roy goes into hiding. He takes off. He grows a beard. And while he's in hiding, he decides to come out and kill John and Anthony Romano. The Romanos were suspecting of setting up the robbery of one of Roy's crew members back in the day. The guy's name was Peter Lafrosca. And this was several years before, and this was just a revenge move because Roy was still pissed about it. So even in hiding, like fucking Walter White comes out and kills two guys. And so the whole time this is going on, at least for a couple of years, Roy Demeo had been planning, or at least trying to plan, his escape. And you can read all about that in the book written by his son, Albert Demeo. And the name of that book is called For the Sins of My Father. According to Albert, in that book, his father had seen the writing on the wall for a long time and had plans to escape. He had complete plans to do it, not to testify, but just to fucking take his money and run. But for Roy, he couldn't escape his own problems. His death had been ordered. And Nino, Anthony, and Joey accepted the responsibility. And on January 10th of 1983, Roy would be killed. And how that went down was Roy was summoned to a meeting at the garage of Patty Testa, who was the brother of Joey Testa. And as Roy enters there, Nino begins firing bullets immediately. Roy probably, well, obviously must have seen the attack coming, because when they found his body, his hands were up like he was trying to block his face. But the bullets just tore through his arms and tore into his face and upper body. Joey and Anthony shot Roy once each behind each ear. And it's a highly symbolic gesture, and much in line with the level of treachery that these savages were accustomed to. Roy's bullet-riddled body was stuffed into the trunk of his own car, partially covered by a chandelier. The frozen body would not be found for a week, and the car was located at a boat club in Sheepshead Bay. Why Roy went there, I'll never know. Maybe he just came to terms with the fact that he knew what was going to happen. There was nothing he could do about it, and he just gave up. And it, once again, as we've seen in movies at times, Roy knew he was going to die, so he leaves his money, all his belongings at home, and just goes and just deals with it. Considering how he handled his own victims in many of the cases, he was given a pretty easy death considering, everything that he'd done in his life. Right after this, Anthony and Joey end up getting aligned with Gaspipe Casso to the Lucchese crime family. Actually, Anthony and Joey attempted to kill Roy's son in an effort to steal Roy's black book of loan sharking customers. It was the only way that I think that they thought they could make inroads to the Lucchese crime family is to begin to, obviously work for Gaspipe Casso, but it really wouldn't last long. Believe it or not, they ran Albert Demeo off the fucking road. His car flipped a bunch of times. They were hell-bent on killing him and taking the black book. And that would have made a good inroad to Gaspipe Casso because it's a lot of money. But, like I said, none of those things would last very long because they would get eventually arrested and indicted like the rest. And the reason why is because Dominic Montiglio shows back up on the scene to collect money. The cops catch him, and he decides to become a federal witness along with Freddie Denome and Vito Arena. The case, once it's all sort of put together, had grown to include 25 murders along with a car ring. Nino at the time was already locked up on another murder and would never see freedom again. He would end up dying in prison a few years later after suffering a heart attack when apparently the guards saw that what was going on and refused to help him. It's worth noting his wife sued the prison system for that, but it would all come tumbling down. Joey Testa and Anthony Center would remain free for just a little bit, while the government continued to look through the case. Like I said earlier, they eventually would mix with the Lucchese crime family, and the rumor that the Gambinos were done with any remnants of the Demeo crew, was nonsense. And what I mean by is the Gambinos were going to kill everybody in that crew. They were going to kill everybody. But probably the Anthony and Joey mixing with Gaspipe, at least on the record with them, probably saved their lives. I'm not going to lie to you. Their violent streak would continue, and they would kill a bunch of people on behalf of Gaspipe Casso before ultimately they're arrested and charged with everything. The last two members of the infamous Demeo crew were still on the streets. Obviously, we're talking about Joey Testa and Anthony Center. But eventually, they get arrested. And in 1989, they were given life sentences for murder and for the car thefts. Henry Borelli would be arrested, got a life sentence. He's been there almost 40 years now. He's been up for parole a bunch of times, but they're not going to let him out. And a lot of that is because of the sheer nonsense and butchery that they participated in. Vito Arena was literally, believe it or not, went to prison, got out, and ends up getting killed in a robbery attempt. He ended up saving his skin by cooperating, but he really never changed as a person, and he ends up getting shot and killed in a robbery attempt. He initially escaped capture from the robbery, but ultimately when he ended up in the hospital with bullet shots, that's what killed him. The other witness, Freddie Denome, committed suicide in 1986. A lot of people have said that he was just straight fucking, I guess, demolished because the Demeo crew had ended up finding his brother Richie and killed him. And that's, that's got to be tough, because the reason why you become an informant to begin with, at least from his particular angle, was so that his brother wouldn't get killed. But they still killed his brother, and he couldn't deal with the day-to-day bullshit of the witness protection program, and so he puts two in his fucking own head. And it's just the whole crew. It's to sum up, it's difficult to do because there's so many things that I could have included more in this show, but it's such a voluminous sort of topic. And like I said, you can read Murder Machine, you can read For the Sins of My Father by Albert Demeo, and you can get more of an inside peek about how Roy was, scheming, where he was hiding money, how he taught his son where to get the money, where to go, where to collect, where to do this. I just don't want to get into all of that, but it's just too much. But ultimately, what leads to the Demeo crew's demise is a part of a couple of things. The first thing is they kill way too many fucking people, and they got a little sloppy with some of the shit they do. If you really want to align it, if you take away what Chris Rosenberg did, if he never kills the drug dealers, which led to the murder of an innocent victim, I think that probably gets Roy another 10 years on the streets. Easy. I still think that you're going to have a problem with Vito Arena. You're still going to have a problem with Dominic Montegulo. But those, from a street perspective, are easier to handle in a certain kind of way. I think that they just got way too big. I think the fact that they got a boss indicted with their nonsense created a lot of problems for them. But it's weird how this works, because if you look at each individual court case that they had, and you look at the way the dominoes started to fall, you would think, as smart as Roy Demeo was, smart because he was a smart guy. He might have been a butcher and everything else, but he was a smart guy. He should have seen this playing out. He should have seen it playing out. You get a run, you get a 10 or 20 year run, and by all accounts, Roy Demeo was a millionaire. So at what point do you reel it back in? And he brings in guys within the fold, like by all accounts, Dirty Henry Borelli. When I say not a bad guy, I mean in terms of the butchery that some of these other guys took part in. He wasn't like that. He ends up taking a plea agreement or a plea deal because Roy tells him to, because Roy thinks that case is going to go away. Was a mistake. He should have never done it. He should have fought. What? Take the fucking auto theft charges. Who gives a fuck? Do your 10 years, you'll be fine. But I just think when you look at the totality of what they did, I think initially, murder for them was an extension of business. And I think that there are certain portions of the people they killed that they probably didn't need to kill. I think at some point, the mentality of it, or the psychopathy of this, is that you get so used to just murdering and dismemberment, it becomes an easy thing to do. And when you go from making a tough business decision because somebody robs you and your reputation's gone, and if you look at it from a street perspective, okay, I understand that. But when you just start killing fucking everybody over small things, that's a problem. Like there's a saying in the streets that keep your head down and just make money. Don't worry about nothing else. There comes a time in the streets when you got to do certain things. And I understand that from a street perspective. I really do understand it. But you also have to look at, there's another saying somebody once told me, and I'll use an example. Somebody owes you $100, all right? You're going to go chop their head off. You're going to go bash them in the head with a bat over $100. It's $100. If your life depends on that $100, and I get the principle of a reputation and all of that shit, I really understand it. Believe me, I do, in ways that people wouldn't understand or believe. But if your whole life depends on that $100 and you're willing to crack somebody on the head, kill them, and go to prison for the rest of your life over $100, then you're in the wrong game. You're in the wrong game. Now, you want to talk $100,000, that's a little different, because that is money. $100 is nothing. I have seen this in my life, and I'm not going to talk about who, and I'm not talking about nobody specific. I'm really not. But I have seen people in my life, maybe I'm related to them, maybe I'm not. Maybe they're friends of mine, maybe they're not. I have seen guys react to somebody owing them money that's a small amount and just saying, you know what, fuck them. I don't got to deal with them anymore. I don't got to see them again. Fuck it. I learned my lesson. That's what I get. Okay, I've seen that reaction, but then I've seen the reverse action of that, where 6 guys hold a guy down and take a fucking hammer to his hands and feet and legs and shit like that. Everything in the streets is reputation. Everything is reputation. But if you want to be feared, there's a right and wrong way of doing it. And while Roy Demeo was ultimately feared, and he should have been, and he was, I don't think there's any question about that. I think you can also go overboard. Now, if you want to control somebody ratting, that's a different story. I understand that from a street perspective. But some of the stuff that they did, like they didn't have to kill Sherry Golden. They didn't have to kill her. They could have just as easily whacked her fucking boyfriend, been done with it, and told her, pack your bags and fucking move. We don't ever want to see you again. But she could talk. and they didn't give themselves, and I understand it from a street viewpoint. They don't want any eyes. They don't want anybody to say, well, this is what happened. This is what happened. Why don't they just call the guy and say, hey, come see us. Don't bring your girl. We got something going on. They could have done that, but they didn't. They just allowed it to happen naturally, and I understand why they did it. But they killed an innocent person, and a woman at that. And then when Paul Castellano finds out about that, that creates a ton of fucking problems. And so we can call it sloppy. We can call it a little psychotic. But I think what ended up happening was, at first it started as, hey, this is what we got to do. This is business. We're protecting our interests. But then I think it became fucking enjoyable. And that's, to me, is like what's disgusting about it. If it becomes enjoyable cutting somebody's fucking head off, there is a big difference between putting two in the back of somebody's fucking head and putting them in a fucking hole versus cutting their fucking head off. Those are some big fucking differences. And this is gross, and you guys are going to call me a psychopath for fucking saying it. Why didn't they use a fucking wood chipper? Put a big tarp behind it, make a fucking thing where it could be caught. Use a fucking wood chipper. That's easier to get rid of somebody than using a fucking hacksaw on their fucking head. These are the things that keep me up at night. Oh, Christ. So let's go down the list of people they killed. In 1978, they killed Michael Mandolino and Nino Martini. Mandolino was a loose associate of the crew who spent a lot of time around Peter LaFrosca. When LaFrosca's home gets robbed, Mandolino was suspected of tipping off the robbers, who ultimately became the Romanos. He gets summoned to a local body shop where he gets gunned down and then stuffed into a car. His body ends up getting dumped, blah, blah, blah. The crew drove the car down the road and dropped it off. And it appeared to be one of the murders that Demeo did want the public to see. The two men were wrapped in tarps together, bound with cords, a classic mob execution. Patrick Prezzano. Patrick was allegedly someone who had stolen jewelry from an associate of Roy Demeo. He was given an opportunity to return the jewelry, but basically told Roy to go fuck himself. And then he ended up wearing the jewelry on his body and walking around town, letting everybody know he fucked Roy over. And Roy personally has an issue with this. And he ends up shooting him in the head, and then he cut his throat from ear to ear. Then he gets tossed in the backseat of a car, and he ends up getting dumped in public. And what Roy does in this particular case, he ends up pulling the guy's pants and underwear down to his ankles to sort of make it look like it was some sort of sexual thing that was going on, or a sexual related crime, which did end up throwing off the police. Kevin Gooley made the mistake of undervaluing, or at least not fearing, Chris Rosenberg. They were friends who were sort of dealing cocaine a little bit together, and he had talked to Chris into loaning him $10,000 so he could get another coke deal started. What really happened with the two of them, or with that transaction, nobody really knows. But basically, Chris shows up and wants his fucking money. The guy basically says, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Chris shoots him dead on the spot. Gary Gardine sort of made the same mistake that the previous person made, and sort of stiffed Chris on money. Gardine was sort of supplied with tons of marijuana. He was fronted a bunch of marijuana to sell. When it came time to pay, he didn't have it. So what does Chris do? He kills him. He stuffs him in the trunk of his car, and then he sets it on fire. And the objective was, we're sending a message to anybody that doesn't want to pay us. Then there's Michael DiCarlo, 5/16/1978. And that was a contracted hit that was done at the request of the Lucchese crime family. DiCarlo was sort of a bodybuilder they nicknamed Mikey Muscles. He was a low-level Lucchese associate who was accused of molesting a young boy. And Roy, believe it or not, through the testimony of Dominic Montiglio, really sort of thought it was hilarious because Anthony Center was contracted to do it. Anthony Center, this is gruesome, but I kind of chuckle at it because I have a sick sense of sort of a macabre sense of humor, so don't hold this against me. But Roy was talking to Dominic, sort of laughing that... they brought Mikey Muscles in, and Anthony Center was using a hammer that they shot him a bunch of times, and fucking Mikey Muscles wouldn't die. So Anthony Center takes a hammer and starts cracking him at 100 miles an hour hundreds of times, and the motherfucker just wouldn't die. I know that sounds crazy, but it's just, to me, it's comical in a sense. It's sick. But it's like, you gotta have a sense of humor like me, where you shoot a guy 6 times, like, the motherfucker won't die. Use a hammer, Anthony. Use a hammer. So he goes to town with him, and he still won't fucking die. Oh, geez, I'm probably gonna get a prescription for fucking Zoloft at this point. Dracula, Uncle Dracula. Here we go. While Anthony is cracking him with a hammer at 100 miles an hour after being shot several times. This is pretty gross, but it's just the way it's phrased. Uncle Dracula, Joseph Guglielmo, at the same time Anthony's cracking him 100 times with a fucking hammer at 100 miles an hour, he's jamming a broomstick up Mikey Muscle's ass. These are the most inept motherfuckers I've ever met. I mean, you shoot him 6 times, you start cracking him with a hammer. I mean, at what point are you standing in a room and you're like, all right, he's shot 6 times, he's still fucking alive. Anthony's cracking him with a hammer all over the place. And Dracula, who's standing there probably eating a slice of fucking cheese pizza, says, huh, I'm going to shove a broom up his ass. I mean, what? Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I'm sorry. I shouldn't laugh at this kind of stuff, but it's just the audacity of standing there looking at a guy who's shot 6 times. You got Anthony over top of him, cracking him with a fucking hammer. He still won't fucking die. And then you just decide, oh, maybe a broomstick up his ass will kill him. I mean, it just shows how fucking inept, oh, God, they were. All right. Joseph Skirty, 9/28/1978. This murder was ordered by Roy Demeo and carried out by Vito Arena and Richie DeNome. Skirty was believed to he was involved with stealing cars, but he sort of was resistant to doing business with Roy Demeo. So Vito basically is ordered to kill him. Vito ends up shooting Scorny. And then fucking here we go again. Oh my God. And then Richie DeNome ends up, while Vito's shooting him, proceeds to beat him to death with a hammer. It was inspired by the Mikey Muscles killing. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Oh my God. Yeah, can't you just shoot a guy in the fucking head? Oh my God, what is it with this hammer shit? Jesus Christ. Ugh. Anyway, they end up killing him. Oh my God. They end up stuffing him into a 55-gallon drum, and he gets tossed off a fishing pier. That killing would earn Vito and Richie full-time jobs with Roy Demeo. But it would also come back to haunt Roy Demeo, because obviously Arena becomes, an informant. All right. Okay, we talked about those 2 murders. We talked about that murder. Okay. Khalid Dude and Ronald Falcaro, they were involved in the car business as well, and basically they were a competitor to Roy's auto theft ring. So when Dowd learns that Roy's operation is going on, he threatens to call the cops, and that's all it took. And he ends up getting lured to Freddie DeNome's garage under the pretense that Freddie had a couple of cars for sale, and Freddie and Roy used this tactic several times when they wanted to kill somebody, and so they end up doing that. And they ended up killing Falcaro only because he was a business partner with Dowd. That was pretty much it. They were shot, then dismembered, and the crew stopped to eat pizza halfway through and hot dogs. Oh, my God. So they stopped to eat pizza and hot dogs midway through dismembering. And that was the double murder right after the Eppolito killings. So Roy technically had killed 4 people in 11 days. Peter Waring was a local coke dealer suspected of cooperating, and after 2 drug busts, he got out of jail, which sort of sent red flags. He had some business dealings with Chris, and he ends up getting lured to the apartment downstairs, where he was shot, stabbed, dismembered, and taken to the Fountain Avenue dump. Scott Cafaro was a local guy who beat a rape case. Nobody really knows whether or not the Demeo crew killed him because there was a contract on him or just on principle that he was a rapist piece of shit. His bullet-riddled body was found on the streets, and it obviously sent a message. It sent word on the streets for a couple things. One, they weren't going to tolerate a rapist, and two, that Roy Demeo was not going to tolerate anybody's, bullshit. Freddie Todaro was set up by his nephew to take over his film production business. Todaro was lured to the apartment behind the Gemini under the pretense of Roy having a car for sale. Once inside, he was shot in the head by Roy, then stabbed repeatedly in the heart by Chris. Chris was not only wearing a pair of briefs, so he didn't get blood on his clothes, but Todaro ultimately ends up getting chopped up and disposed of at the Fountain Avenue dump. Probably the reason for this was probably a contract killing. Joe Coppolino, 3/7/1980. Joe Coppolino suffered pretty much a pretty nasty death. He was stabbed to death by Roy, then decapitated. The reason why he was killed was he was suspected to be in a cooperating sort of informant about Demeo's drug operations. Coppolino, though, however, they didn't hide the body. They wanted that to be seen publicly, and it was. Patrick Penny was the witness who called the cops on Nino and Roy after the Eppolito hits. He was the witness that said he saw it. He also testified in Nino in court, which also resulted in Nino's 5 to 15-year sentence. Gaji could have killed Patrick Penny at any time during the trial, but he feared that if he did that, it would create more problems. So he waited and told Roy he wanted him dead. Detectives had kind of gotten grumblings that Penny could be in some trouble, and they warned him and that he should just get out of town. He didn't. Vito Areno ends up tracking him down, and he tells Roy. They ended up sort of kind of watching his moves, and in 5/12/1980, Roy, Vito, and Richie Denome, that they ended up shooting him dead in the street, and that was the end of that. Charles Mongitor and Daniel Scataro. This was another freelance contract. Montegore had previously been stabbed, and he pressed charges on his assailant, whose father contacted Roy and said, "We need this guy to go away." Montegore was warned multiple times not to cooperate with police, but he ended up saying, "Fuck you, I'll do what I want," not really truly understanding that the people that were going to kill him were not going to fuck around. He ends up getting lured to a garage of Richie Denome, where he is shot to death by Roy and Henry Borello. Scutaro was simply just a friend of Montegore who sort of went along for the ride, and they killed him too. Let's see, James Bennett. 4/29/1981 was a cooperating witness who was soon to testify against one of Roy's friends and associates. He would end up getting shot multiple times in the head by two masked men. Obviously, we know those men are Joey and Anthony. Joe Vigiano, 12/4/1981. Joseph was in debt to one of Roy's business partners. He was also sort of dealing in the pornography business, and like so many other of Roy's victims, Vigiano was shot to death and was dismembered. Man, this just keeps going on. Let's see. All right. So 1984, Richie Denome, Fred Seaton, and John Beta, 2/4/1984. Richie, obviously, we know, is the younger brother of Freddie, and he was murdered basically because he knew too much about the murders in the stolen car theft ring. They were trying to sort of stifle anybody that could give any information. He was just viewed by the Demeo crew as a weak link and somebody who could talk. And obviously, so we know what happens. Joey Testa and Anthony Center end up killing him. And as a result, that's what turns Freddie Denome into an informant. And you can just see how it goes. Vladimir Reznikov. This was a big one. 6/13/1986. Obviously, Joey Testa and Anthony Center had gone to work for Gas Pipe Casso. And this actually has to do with sort of the gas scheme. I've talked about it a lot over the show. But Reznikov was causing problems and making threats. And so Casso orders Joey Testa and Anthony Center to kill Reznikov. And that's what they do. Nicky Guido was another piece of work by the Gemini twins, by Anthony Gaspipe Casso. They were the shooters who killed Anthony Guido, who was an innocent victim. He looked like somebody they were looking for, had the same name as somebody they were looking for. It turns out it was a fucking mistake. 1987, the last murder, Carmine Variale and Frank Santora. The Gemini twins, really, this is the last murder they committed on sort of, listen, the double murder of Variale and Santora was really the last known killing that any crew member was ever involved in, and it was a job given to Anthony and Joey by Anthony Gaspipe Casso. And not long after that, they would be arrested. Not long after that murder, they would be arrested, and obviously they've been in prison the rest of their lives. I could go through another 80 or so murders. I don't want to do it. It's just too much. Hey, listen, I apologize for laughing. Just sometimes shit tickles me, and it's just funny, and it just, from a macabre, just comedic standpoint, it just cracks me up. Not that, God forbid, somebody died. It's shitty, but it is what it is. So that is really the end of it. They are going to be known as probably the most ferocious and feared crew ever in the mob's existence. Had they just toned it back a little bit and been a little smarter and not so hell-bent on murder and butchering and all of that, they might have survived a little bit longer. And it's not to say that they were totally sloppy in what they did, but I've always been of the mind that if you don't have a body, you don't have a crime. And if they had followed that tactic, it might have been, better suited for them. I think history will look back on them as more serial killers than mobsters. I hate to say that, but that's just the reality of it. I think once you reach the point where you're cutting everybody up, there's a sickness to all of that. But I think from a business standpoint, I mean, sometimes too much is too much. And that's why Gotti and them wouldn't go after him. They were terrified of these guys. Because, listen, if every single one of them has no problem cutting your fucking heart out and eating it or some crazy shit like that, or you have a septuagenarian standing in the corner eating a slice of pie while they're cracking somebody with a hammer and just decides, well, let's stick the broomstick up his ass. That'll help. Joe Guglielmo disappeared. Nobody knows where he went. A lot of people have talked about him. Maybe he's dead. I believe Dominic Monteglio said at one point that he drank himself to death, but he was the only crew member to get out. According to Albert Demeo in his book, For the Sins of My Father, his uncle Joe got on a plane and just took off. Said, fuck this, I'm done. I don't think the Demeo crew killed him. I believe what Albert said, that he got on a plane and safely got out of New York. And he probably died of old age, maybe drinking, who knows. But he's the only member of the Demeo crew that made it out without going to prison. A lot of people have talked about Anthony Center and Joey Testa getting out of prison. They've had a bunch of parole hearings. I know that Anthony stopped going to them. Like I said, probably on the first incarnation of the Demeo crew. But they're never going to get out. They have too many bodies. I mean, even if they could get a parole hearing, I mean, how are you going to explain 80 murders? Explaining one is one thing. 80, 90, 100, 200, whatever. How do you explain that? If there's anybody that might have the opportunity of getting out, maybe Henry Borelli, because Dirty Henry has done all of his time already for the most part, but they're not going to let him out either just because of the body count. We're not talking 4 murders, 5 murders. We're not even talking Sammy the Bull's alleged 19 murders. We're talking like 200 plus, and they just didn't shoot people, as we've discussed on this show. They had an interesting way of doing stuff. So none of them guys are ever going to get out. They're never going to get out. And maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they shouldn't. And so I know what the thought process is going to be for the listeners. Say, wow, you're not sticking up for them. You're not saying they didn't do it. It's kind of hard not to say they didn't do it in this particular case. If this happened once or whatever, okay, we're talking like 200 plus. It's kind of hard for me to argue. It's kind of hard for me to, argue that logic. But I'm sure that there are certain things, and this is just being honest, that I'm sure there's certain things they were convicted of they didn't do. But that's just the reality of it all. I don't think Dominic Montiglio is the most honest guy in the fucking world, and I've said that from day one. I don't think he told the truth about a whole lot. I don't think Vito Arena was very honest either. I don't think any informant is. But when you have like a dozen informants that are pointing where the bodies are and they can connect the dots, if you connect the dots for the federal government, that's all they need. That's all they need. So that is the history of the Roy Demeo crew. I hope you enjoyed it. Despite my laughter at some stuff, but we will be back, all new show next week. We are going to do a massive Q&A. Excuse me. And you can head over to Facebook and look for the post. It'll say Q&A and go, or you can email us your questions at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. That will be next week's show. And then the following week, we will have a guest on to talk about Sammy the Bull, the Bravano. So I wanted to thank everybody for listening in. I hope you got some entertainment out of me laughing. I'm going to go to hell for that one. Anyway, have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next week right here. Same time, same channel. I was going to say same bat time, same bat channel, but I'll tell you how much of a fucking dork I am. Anyway, all that being said, everybody have a great week, and we will be back next week on an all-new episode of Mob Talk Radio.